they would be, go through the Soviet bureaucracy. But while that's happening, your employer is told that you're trying to emigrate, or you know, the dean of the university you're attending is told this. The super in your building is told this, right? So all these different levels of your life suddenly become a lot harder. People start losing their jobs. People are kicked out of university. And in the Soviet Union, it was illegal to be unemployed. So you would get fired from your job for trying to emigrate, and then you'd be unemployed, and no one would hire you because you're trying to emigrate, and then you'd be arrested for how to translate it, loaferism, being a bum basically, not having a job. Um, and so it was a really tricky situation for a lot of people. In addition to that, once you were given the opportunity to emigrate, what would happen is you then had to pay the Soviet government back for your education, for example. So these were huge sums of money that were just made up, right? Because it was a free university education for all citizens. And so as a result, they would just make up an extraordinarily high number. It was about the price of a car, which was also like an impossible dream back then. And you were told you had to pay the government back because you were leaving and you weren't grateful for it. Uh, then to kind of one more thing that would happen as you were leaving, you were usually given a very, very small allotment of what you were allowed to take out of the country. I've heard stories, for example, like you were given one suitcase per family, for instance, or you were told you weren't allowed to take certain things like children's toys because, I don't know, you were trying to smuggle out like national treasures or something. Um, obviously the treatment was very poor. And then at the border itself, you would turn in your internal passport, and it was basically ripped up in front of you. You were stripped of your citizenship. You were now a stateless person, and you were just sent on your way. So, for instance, my first ever Russian professor, she emigrated in 1980, and her family was supposed to go to Israel. Well, I mean, they told the government they were going to Israel. They left. They were sent out of the Soviet Union to Rome, and then they had never actually intended to go to Israel. They had family in New York, so they ended up in New York. So that's what would happen to you afterwards, and then you were on your own. So, what has happened since the end of the Soviet Union? All those emigration controls went away in 1991, and so there was a huge outpouring of people, and Jews probably higher than even the rest of the population. Obviously, a huge number we know went to Israel, where now Israel has a giant Russian-speaking population, and then of course to the U.S., to Canada, Western Europe, and also, you no longer had the strictures on religious practice. It wasn't against, it wasn't hard. The law didn't make it hard to practice Judaism anymore. And so, you had a much more open practice of religion. A lot of people who knew that they were ethnically Jewish but had never celebrated a holiday were now given the opportunity. And organizations, especially international organizations like Chabad, were able to come in and develop Jewish life. And Chabad's been one of the main drivers of contemporary Jewish life in the former Soviet Union. Basically, I think the role of every quote unquote chief rabbi, who's just a rabbi that the government recognizes, is a Chabad rabbi in any part of the country or of any country. So the chief rabbi of Russia, the chief rabbi of Ukraine, for instance, both Chabad rabbis. And actually, for much of the post-Soviet period, attitudes toward Jews have largely improved. And there was a lot less everyday anti-Semitism. It just was not as a big a deal to people anymore. And part of this, I think, was because once the Soviet Union collapsed, when Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and all these other countries, started developing their own laws, their own regulations, and they got rid of that ethnicity line in your ID card. So, it just was less of a big deal to people. And, thankfully, attitudes have changed. People have, come around on things. The things were getting so much better that actually there was a U.S. State Department cable on the topic, and one section was labeled Jewish relations in Russia from oy vey to okay. Today, in Moscow, for example, there is a excellent museum of Jewish history. I would suggest going there, but well, you can't. It was largely funded, though, of course, through foreign money, mostly Dutch money. I think it was a Anne Frank Foundation, and Israeli money. It's very thorough. It goes from basically like the settlement of Jews in the territory that's now Russia, all the way to today. It does have some political overtones, especially as you get towards the latter part of the exhibition. You basically end with a video telling you how Putin ended anti-Semitism in the country. It's a little overblown, um, but for the most part, it's very good. But unfortunately, since Russia's full-scale invasion, we've actually seen a rise of anti-Semitism again in the country. It's been tied to various things. For example, the former chief rabbi of Moscow was forced to flee the country because he wouldn't support the war. And so there was kind of some official anti-Semitism coming that way. There's also kind of the anti, it's this very weird, paradoxical kind of thing coming up with the war in Ukraine is that part of Russia's motivation or part of its propaganda to justify its war is that they need to quote unquote denazify Ukraine because Ukraine was kind of rehabilitating some of the people who fought against Soviet occupation, which meant that a lot of those people fought with the Nazis. And therefore, it's been used as a sort of wedge to claim that Ukraine's government is pro-Nazi, pro-fascism. And at the same time, of course, Ukraine has a Jewish president. So how do they balance that? Well, they use anti-Semitic overtones when talking about Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and then also say you're denazifying it by claiming he's the Nazi. It's very confusing. But there's also other reasons for some of the increased anti-Semitism around the country. There are parts of southern Russia in the Caucasus region that are predominantly Muslim, that there's been some anti-Semitism linked to anti-Israel sentiment that's come up. There's been some coming up in the media claiming, something that, we've heard elsewhere, right? That Jews are too overrepresented or control media or control financial institutions. So unfortunately, the okay might be going more oy vey at this point. And so with that, I just want to conclude. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to talk with you. And Shabbat Shalom again. What? Oh, thanks.
That's interesting. Would you like to take some questions?
I can take questions too.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Dr. Latham.
Yeah.
With the role that to Russia and
Mhm. Yeah.
how does that reconcile with being approving or not or disapproving of it?
Yeah. So as a so that moment, right? That was like the big like kind of wake up call, like, oh, this is getting bad in Russia right now. And I think a lot of people in higher levels of government realize that and realize that they had to get more control over the regional governments because it took way too long for the police to stop that in southern Russia, what you're talking about. Basically, a mob breaks through and tries to essentially commit a pogrom against the passengers on this plane. And so I think there was enough pressure internationally and from people on high to realize to say like, oh, we got to actually prosecute these people. And also, it's actually beneficial for the government in the long run because they like to crack down on what they view as extremist groups at various times, and anyone can be an extremist group at any moment. And so this group, for example, was very clearly one, and what really clearly like doing something illegal. And so it's an easy like win for the government to kind of reassert control over a region that is very hard for the Russian government to control normally. Yeah.
what you're giving the good part of them a Muslim
Mhm.
that go along with what you're saying. They need, because in the past, Russian government, whether it was Soviet or whatever, was crushed.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, no, exactly.
population was under the radar and not focused.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah, in the post-Soviet period, that is definitely a contributing factor to the decline in anti-Semitism, in that the government's kind of focus and a lot of people's attention was not on Jews as a kind of potential threat or enemy, because Russia had fought a war against the Chechens, the international or the global war on terror, for example. So there were other kinds of potential worries that people had that I think did, kind of took away their attention from Jews potentially. Yeah.
Just, I'm Jewish people tend to go on the Russian side, the RSS. I know a lot of idea Ukrainian soldiers are fighting with Ukraine right now. What's the place of Jews in this war? And then we finished with was a little the tone was a little sad.
Mhm.
Like from okay to Oy big, but if you have anything for the future for the Russian Jews, and you see it's like turning around better.
No, I do not. So, what you've seen is so I mentioned right that the chief rabbi of Moscow had to leave. The role of Jews in the war. I mean, Jews are being drafted and Jews are participating in it. There's very little on the Russian side of like any kind of publicity about a distinctly like Jewish presence in the Russian military. So on the Ukrainian side, very different. On the Ukrainian side, like you'll see the chief rabbi of Kiev with soldiers in trenches, for example, and they were really trying to emphasize that all Ukrainians of all backgrounds are involved in this. In Russia, that's not as much of a push, and it's not really emphasized. What I can say also for kind of your everyday Jewish life, that especially like in the immediate post-war period, a lot of uh, a lot of people who hadn't ever thought about emigrating or about getting Israeli citizenship have changed their minds. So a lot more people went over to Israel, have been able to claim citizenship, or have moved there, or have moved elsewhere. So there's a larger kind of Russian emigration out of the country happening now anyway, and Jews are definitely a portion of it. Yeah,
And Pakistan in those areas.
very very small. So the biggest in Central Asia, the biggest Jewish population were the Jews of Samarkand in Uzbekistan, and I think like 95% of them now live either in Israel or in Queens. So it's like specifically Queens. So yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, that whole aspect, and it's an area of Jewish life that's sadly understudied. Um, because the presence is no longer there, and because it was such it's an area that gets less attention in the world anyway. So you just get much less information about it. There are smaller Jewish populations in these other countries. I met someone who was Jewish in Kazakhstan, for example. Um, and largely it was just like his ethnic background. That's all, like, that was the only kind of connection he really had to it. Um, Very much a Russified kind of Soviet person who happened to be born in Kazakhstan.
One more question? We have time for one more? I think that was fascinating.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. I understood there was a great finish waiting for us, and so let's go and thank you again to the Laskins for sponsoring Fiddish. And for sharing your wonderful scholarship with us. He's a pretty It's not a big land, that, you know.